So this is a 1 hour event, which has 4 speakers. So I'm going to ask the speakers to introduce themselves quickly in 2 sentences before we start the talk. Who wants to start?
I'll go. My name is Ike Moore. I'm the EDI, Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Administrator at Zoological Society of London and Institute of Zoology.
Hi, I'm Chris Jackson. I'm a geoscientist based at Imperial College in London. And yeah, that's me really. I guess you'll find out a bit more about me when I talk.
My name is Bat and I'm a taxonomist working on grasses at Kew Gardens.
My name is Miranda and I'm the Principal Curator at the Natural History Museum in London.
So the format is as such that we're going to have 4 talks of 10 minutes each, and then hopefully 15 minutes at the end to ask questions and discuss. Now, very helpfully, Lucy and Helen have put together a Padlet, which I think will be shared in the text bit of this event, where you can really share your thought, reflect on the event, ask a question, or share any advice that you may have. And this is because we're completely conscious that it's very difficult to cover all the questions and really go into the depths of those discussions in 15 minutes. So please do not hesitate to use that Padlet. And I know that all the speakers are aware of it and are really keen to engage with you on that platform. So without delay, we're going to start with the first speaker, Chris, which will talk about issues related to race and racism in geosciences. Chris.
Can you see my slides full screen? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so thank you so much for the invitation to come and talk today. I'll get straight into it. This is the work of a bunch of different people, all of whom are kind of listed on the slide here. And we're going to be looking at race, racism, and barriers to participation in geological sciences, which I believe has a lot of overlap with environmental sciences more generally. And we're going to be looking at how bad is it, should we do something about it, and what can we do about it? So I like to be positive, even though it's absolutely hammering it down with rain and grey here in Norway. I'm going to be upbeat at the end. So why focus on diversity in geosciences? Well, the 21st century is going to require us, okay? There's a number of different social, environmental, economic challenges across the world in numerous different ways, which are captured here in this poster produced by Geoscience for Global Development, in areas of geohazard mitigation, in engineering geology, water security, soil quality as pertains to agriculture and therefore health and financial well-being of certain nations. If we're going to tackle these challenges, we need to know how to work with different people and understand those global problems, because we're not just trying to solve local problems and address local challenges. But geoscience lacks racial diversity, which would be a basis for being able to work with all these different communities in a sustainable way. And this diversity crisis, as we refer to in our paper, is a result of these historic racism discipline-specific issues, which we're going to look at now. So how bad is it? This is some data which we collected, and the first bit of data here is UK Census data. So Black, Asian, minority ethnics, what proportion of those are in the 18 to 24 age group in the UK? So, or what do they represent? It's about 18.5%. If we look at BAME students in undergraduate education in UK higher education, it's above that actually, it's about 25%. So this is for UK domiciled students. But if we look at BAME students in the undergraduate's physical sciences, and physical sciences are shown there at the bottom, what that includes, we can see it's lower than the total population representation at around about 17%. And if we then move on to look at BAME students in undergraduate geology education, there's a big drop off again to 10%. So there's the progressive slide of underrepresentation, you could argue, for BAME students in geology, on top of the kind of underrepresentation at the physical science level of which geology is part. Where do those students go? so there's this notion of high tariff universities. So these are kind of the Russell Group and associated universities. So you can see that the BAME representation in the Russell Group universities is under 4%. And this notion of high tariff universities is partly related to things like league tables in a kind of a notional idea of what a high tariff or high quality university is, driven by things like Phil Batty and the Times Higher Education. And then there's this idea of low tariff universities, which is the inverse, obviously, of high tariff. And it's a rather dismissive and disgusting term, which I wouldn't, I don't use. But I think if you're referring to high tariff universities, you're saying something about the others. And you can see that there's a much bigger representation of BAME students in those low tariff universities. And I leave it with the audience to think about why that might be. Why might there be kind of a larger representation, and why might those students be choosing or only able to access education in those non-high tariff universities? We can talk about that in the panel, perhaps. If we move on to look at postgraduate research, so moving from undergraduate to postgraduate research, so we're not looking at masters here, we're just going straight to postgraduate research, so PhDs. We can see that BAME student representation there is about 18.1% in UK higher education. In physical science, again, and we looked at what that included, there was geography, geology, veterinary studies, the classic STEM disciplines as well. And we can see it's about 12.1%. So again, an underrepresentation when you start to look at physical science versus the kind of entire population of that student group in the UK higher education system. And if we look at geology, again, it's around about 10%. So again, you can see those numbers decreasing to the right. If we think about where those students might get money from to do postgraduate research, obviously a lot of it will come from the UK funding agencies, but also, self-funded students. But again, think about why some of those BAME students might not be able to self-fund. If you think about UKRI, only 9% of their PhD studentship awards go to BAME students, and they use the term ethnic minorities rather than BAME, and that's another discussion for the panel, maybe about which terms we feel comfortable with. NERC, it's even less than that, it's 6%. So this is relevant perhaps to the DTP to which I'm speaking today. And if we think about what that means as part of, as the total of the amount of students who might be able to access that funding, of which we've kind of in this assessment, we've said between 18 and 34 years old, as part of the total UK population, it's 20%. So there's massive underrepresentation of those groups in terms of their awarding or them receiving awards from NERC and UKRI. So why do we have this attrition? Well, there's a number of different things. Awarding or attainment gap, that's the notion that students who go in with the same A levels to start with, actually, if they're from an ethnic minority, they're likely to get half a degree classification less than a white counterpart. Our application systems fail to account for some of the biases that might stop BAME students accessing education, and there's a lack of representation at faculty level. Sorry, my kid's knocking on the window outside. And I will look at that in the next slide. And then there's some things which are more geoscience specific, right? So there's this issue that a lot of students who are doing geosciences do it because they grew up in these rural environments surrounded by nature, inspired by their love of rocks. But if we have a larger number of BAME potential students living in urban environments who don't have access to that rural environment, they may not be getting that same spark and inspiration from, by default, of where they just grew up. And then there's this issue of fieldwork barriers as well. There's all these things which kind of can put off students from accessing geoscience in that way. So just to go back to that last slide where we talked about this idea of a hostile environment and why people might not feel that geosciences is for them. This is the state of play in terms of BAME professors in UK higher education. So I just really want to focus on these numbers in the bottom right, in that there's 217,000 academic staff in the UK universities a couple of years ago. Only 4,000 or just a few more, about 2% were Black. And of over 21,000 professors, only 0.7% are Black. So that's 140, and I'm one of them. And of that, only 25 of those Black professors are women in the entire landscape of the UK universities. So what can we do about it to end positively? And we can try and broaden participation. We can adapt fieldwork and reform accreditation, so fieldwork is contextualized better. We can have things like summer schools and paid internships to maybe mitigate some of the impacts and the financial barriers that BAME students face. We can try and modernize teaching so that we actually recognize and engage with some of the colonial history of geosciences and make it more welcoming for BAME students. And we can also try and remove some structural inequalities by making the application processes more transparent, giving people support, removing discriminatory practices around choosing students. And I've already talked about this with London DTP directors on Twitter and places like that, so we can pick that up in the panel, and ring fence funding as well. Just to finish, what are some of the challenges to this? Well, a few months ago, Ben Britton, a friend of mine, issued some Freedom of Information Act requests to find out what the state of play was regarding the policies and procedures for scoring candidates for recruitment, shortlisting and awarding, thinking about who's selecting who are the potential supervisors, how diverse are they, what the diversity of the panels are and the demographic information that's collected to then underpin improvements to your selection process. Well, first of all, the responses, there's a number of refusal notices. I won't go into the details, but I can send this to you if you'd like to see them. There's a problem with small numbers. When you've got tiny numbers, as UKRI showed today in their press release, you just have to put, like, you know, if there's less than 5, you just anonymize it, right? And then there's this problem of competing interests, right? So Birmingham, who responded to this particular one through the Centre DTP, refused to provide information on the request because it was deemed commercially sensitive and that it would impact the university's financial and reputational success by declaring things around how they were recruiting students and actually telling us what was in their paperwork. So again, I leave that with you, that although we may have our best interests at heart in terms of challenging some racially discriminatory practices, there are other bits of our institutions which have other interests, and that will challenge how we try and take this forward. So if you want to know more, thank you so much. I encourage you to read this preprint, which is currently in review, Diversity Crisis in UK Geoscience Research Training by Dowie et al. And I'm happy to forward that on to anybody else who's interested. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chris, for a really good first presentation. So please do not hesitate to ask your question in the chat or later on in the Padlet. And we'll go with the second speaker now, Miranda, who will talk about decolonial approaches to museum collection. Miranda.
Everyone see that? Brilliant, fantastic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hidden figures within natural history collections. And as many of us here on this chat and the presentations will be doing field work, collecting specimens, and eventually some of them may end up within museums. So as I said in my introduction, I'm essentially, my job title is a principal curator of the Natural History Museum. So the right-hand picture is what I do most of the time. So that's about, I would say, 60 to 70% of my job is accessing collections and giving other people access and writing labels, doing a lot of documentation around the historical collections and more recent incoming subsamples from the oceans. And then on the left-hand side is me in my lab, kind of a bit of a stylized picture. So the other part of my job, I don't do enough research. So I'm a marine biologist by trade. So I study marine invertebrates, crustacea, and Cnidaria essentially. But with that being said, I've noticed over time, because of the two hats that I wear within my role, that you know, what museums are missing in terms of their interpretation in the museum galleries, the diversity or the lack of diversity in the workforce, because myself as a natural history curator, I'm one of very few Black female curators in the UK. I've not measured myself up in terms of natural history sort of globally, but you know, that is a concern when we are looking at embracing and becoming more fair, diverse and inclusive organisations across the board. So in 2007, a lot of cultural organisations were commemorating the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. With that being said, the Natural History Museum, alongside many others, were looking at particular projects and had funding for particular projects to do at that point in time in terms of the commemoration. And reimagining, looking at their collections again in that light. And so the museum had some funding, and we had at the time community engagement team, and they brought together myself as a curator and a scientist of colour, but also members of the community, such as elders that are of African and Caribbean heritage, to look at those collections and some events around it. What the museum produced was a really amazing document. Find it online since 2018 in its entirety. It's a document called Slavery in the Natural World, a really brilliant document. But with all things being said, and a lot of us get involved in doing project work, and funding is for just a short period of time. That project wrapped up. The document went online, but it was fragmented online. So there's something to be said about accessibility. And with all the internet that we've got, sometimes we cannot find things when we really need them, and they're not pride of place after such great work is done. But a number of stories within that document, so it's a 10-chapter document, resonated with me. And what you can see here, and I don't want to assume that everybody has read this paper, but this paper, so Nature read in black and white, Decolonial Approaches to Interpreting Natural History Collections, came out of that original body of work by the museum, because the stories, there was a selection of stories in there that resonated with me and my cultural history. And at the time also, or just after 2007, I was sort of seeing on the wider landscape in terms of the culture and heritage sector, that people were talking again about decolonialism, decolonial practice. And I just wondered, what does that mean in the sense of natural history collections? And also with museums and galleries wanting to attract diverse audiences, I wasn't seeing any of those narratives put out there of Black, Asian, ethnic minorities, of their contribution to sites within the natural history realm. And so this paper came out of a provocation session within a Natural Sciences Collections Association conference with my co-author Sabadra Das. And within this paper, we examine scientific racism in the first half of the paper. In the second half is where I tease out some more of those stories that were in the original Slavery in the Natural World document by the Natural History Museum, because I also felt that there was a lot that I could put of my whole self into this work as well. So not just as a professional curator and scientist, but as a person with African and Caribbean heritage too. And, you know, kind of bringing those narratives to the forefront of those that have been either written out of history, didn't write their own narrative. So one of the stories actually applies to this ceiling that you can see here. So this is known as, since 2005, the Gilded Canopy. It's a Hinsey Hall, so it's the main hall within the Natural History Museum, and it comprises with about 162 beautiful interpretations of plants, which actually represent the trading and the British Empire and colonialism. And there was one story, one of those ceiling panels that resonated with me, and it's this panel. There is a plant called Quassia Amara. And you can see on either side visual representations of that plant. So one illustration, the other one, the real plant. And this plant was named after Graman Quassi, so it's the gentleman on your left, and it was Carl Linnaeus. And I'm not assuming that you all know who Carl Linnaeus is, but you know, he is represented as the person who popularized plants and animal flora and fauna taxonomy. And what is really interesting about this story is that you don't find many instances, and in the chat, it'd be great to hear if there are any more, where somebody of European heritage, a scientist and a naturalist, so Carl Linnaeus, formerly mainly known as a Swedish botanist, actually naming a plant after someone, a person of color, and actually acknowledging them for the, I would call Graman Quassi actually a botanist and a healer at that time. So in the mid-1700s, Graman Quassi, he was previously enslaved, and then he was taken as a child to Suriname, where he grew up, and he learned the medicinal practices of those indigenous peoples. And eventually, so with this plant, Quassia amara, he became known as the doctor in that environment, and he would treat all manner of people, so not just the indigenous people to Suriname, but also because Suriname was a Dutch colony at that point in time, but also the Dutch as well. So by boiling the leaves and the bark of this plant, it was known as a bitter tea, which would actually purge intertestinal parasites and reduce fever. And eventually, Graman Quassia sold his recipe and the other interesting properties around this plant to a student of Colonial, I think his name was Daniel Rolander, who then took a sample of the plant and the recipe back to Sweden to Colonial, who eventually published and named the plant officially after Graman Quassia. So what you can see here, actually, the imagery of Graman Quassia, he's slightly a controversial figure. So at the same time, I'm kind of raising up and holding up his narrative and the work that he did as a botanist in terms of the plant. He was controversial in the sense that he fought against the local Marines in Suriname. He fought alongside the Dutch, and he eventually got his ear cut off. So whereas I talk about that story in terms of natural history, and I live in the UK, but I do acknowledge that in places like Suriname, that he may be thought of in a more negative light in terms of the colonization of the Dutch within Suriname at that point in time. But nonetheless, it is a story to reveal and to acknowledge that a person of colour had some part to play, because this plant also is being used in pharmacology still today, its medicinal properties. So another person that I highlight here and their narrative is Ali Wallace. So Ali Wallace was a guide to, a local guide in Malaysia to Alfred Russel Wallace. So a lot is known in science about Alfred Russel Wallace. He was alongside Darwin. I'm losing my train of thought. He actually was, alongside Darwin, he actually was instrumental in the evolution of man, and also he studied plants and collected insects and birds in Malaysia and throughout the Amazon. Now, Ali's important part here was that he had a lot of the local knowledge to impart to Wallace. And it's interesting to examine how Wallace actually wrote about Ali in his autobiography, saying that when Ali was sick, he would look after Ali, and then vice versa, Ali would look after him. So an interesting examination of, we're not always thinking about that, oh, the indigenous knowledge is being stripped from that indigenous person. But in this sense, the relationship was slightly different because it was more of a caring and sharing. And what my revealing this story in more depth has shown actually is that the collection of the birds that Ali possibly had collected with Wallace is not actually documented in that way within our collections. It's documented as the Alfred Russel Wallace collection. So my work here has some way to go in kind of changing the labels and acknowledgement of who collected and whose label was used at this point in time. And then the last example here is of John Edmonston with Charles Darwin. So we often think about Charles Darwin as this old bearded man, but what about him as a young boy, as a teenager? At the age of 17, he went to Edinburgh to study medicine. He didn't quite like the dissections and learning about medicine, but he also came across John Edmonston, who was previously enslaved in South America, and came with his previous owner, who was Charles Edmonston, to Glasgow, and then John moved on to Edinburgh, where at Edinburgh University, he taught a lot of the students there taxidermy. And this is how Charles Darwin came across him. And it's just wonderful to know that how much of an influence that John Edmondson had on the young Charles Darwin before he even went on the voyage of the Beagle, that ship on his first expedition at the age of 21, 22. But later on in Charles Darwin's life, he writes in his autobiography about that meeting, that experience with John Edmondson. And you can only imagine that, as well as the taxidermy skills that Charles Darwin learnt, but he also would have heard the stories of what it was like to be enslaved, what the plants and the animals you might see there in South America. So I took a lot of this work and I built that into a tour at the museum in the main hall. So there is just a tweet, complete surprise to people who had attended a late event at the museum at that time. So this tour was not advertised as part of it. It was me trialing that out for the very first time, and we got some brilliant feedback, and people obviously want more. And it's great in terms of diversity and these stories, for people to hear stories about themselves, people of colour to hear stories about themselves and their heritage, but also other people that don't come from that heritage, but getting an insight into the collections. And this, yes, I'm up now. Yeah, so I just want to show this is it. Yeah, I've got one more slide and then I'm done.
Okay.
So just in terms of the diversity that Chris was talking about earlier. So in terms of that, you know, we have to go out there. We can't always expect people to come to our institutions and things like that in terms of the work that we do. To go out there in terms of doing our outreach. So I work with Glass Fest, and I want to see more diversity in the museum. So I'm one of the co-founding members of Museum Detox, which works with you know, people of colour within the museum and heritage sector. So that's them around my colleague. So I'm done.
Thank you so much, Miranda. Sorry, it's because it's so short. 4 speakers question. I have to go. So I'm going to go next to Bat, who is going to talk about decolonizing natural sciences in sub-Saharan Africa. Bat, please.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay? So I will start by talking through a few examples from my own research. And I'd like to show you how little we often know about inequalities that are hiding in our very own research areas right under our noses. This first slide is from work that we did a few years ago. So as a woman in science, I had an idea of looking at how many plant names were described, how many plant species were published by women versus men. And nowadays we expect that about 1/3 of all publications are produced by female-led teams. And in fact, for plants, only 12% of species, even to this day, are described by women. And to me, it really showed that often we misjudge our own disciplines when we're not looking in the right place. My second example from a paper last year is we got numbers together for how many plants went extinct and how many plants were rediscovered across the world. And if you look at this map, you will see that dark gray places have many plant extinctions and many plant rediscoveries. Contrary to everybody's expectations, wealthier countries have more extinct plants. In Australia, in South Africa, in much of southern United States and Mexico. And you'll see that a lot of sub-Saharan Africa suspiciously has no extinct plants. Is this really true? So this is the slide I wanted to show next. It's actually a documented phenomenon in the biodiversity sciences that the lower the GDP of a country, the lower our level of knowledge of biodiversity in that country. So if everybody can have a look at the pink purple countries down the bottom left-hand side, sub-Saharan Africa, lowest per capita GDP, lowest inventory completeness. So we can see that places that suffer economically also suffer from the results of their science and all aspects of the scientific process there. I've been working with many colleagues in Madagascar for the past 10 years, studying the grasses of Madagascar. This is my third and last example from my personal research journey. And this slide compares actually Malagasy vertebrates, so papers published by Malagasy institution authors versus papers published by foreign institution authors. And as you can see through time, papers by Malagasy colleagues have only risen a little bit, and papers by non-Malagasy colleagues about Malagasy diversity have risen a lot. And what this final example have taught me is we often make the assumption that inequality is getting better in our discipline, and that things are looking up, and actually things are not looking up, and in many cases things are actually getting worse. So I'm not very happy to tell you that my Malagasy colleagues now have less opportunity to publish, I think, comparatively to their foreign counterparts on their own biodiversity. What can we do about this? I'm pleased to tell you, so at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, we have benefited this year from a top-down approach to decolonization. As an organization, I guess we're quite late to the game. Miranda, I'd love to be able to tell you that we started thinking about this back in 2007, and I'm afraid that's not really the case for us as an institution. But this slide shows a conversation article published by the Kew Director of Science, Alex Antonelli, saying it's time to decolonize botanical collections. This article was published in June this year. And, you know, I was surprised the extent to which it caused actually quite a lot of big emotional reactions on the internet, both positive and both negative reactions. And the article led to us starting a decolonization working group at Kew. And unfortunately, I'm not ready to present the full findings of the decolonizing working group. We're working towards publishing our first report at the end of January. But maybe before the end of my talk, I'll share with you just a few things that we'd learned in our organization. So we have about 1,000 people in Kew, scientists and volunteers, and we have quite an extensive international network of botanists all over the world. And we learned so far that explicit senior management support has really helped many of us come forward, speak about these issues openly. The senior management support, so many of us were given time, we were given paid working hours to really learn, educate ourselves and talk amongst ourselves on these subjects, which have proven invaluable. So in the decolonization group space, basically it's given us space in the right emotional environment, basically a dedicated place where we can sit down remotely or in person. And you know, these issues aren't easy at all in our workplaces, and time and thinking and talking are needed. And for a lot of my colleagues who've maybe spent less time thinking about it than me, colleagues who haven't spent time like me working in Madagascar, it takes a lot of thinking time and a lot of discourse to really shift our perspectives. So at the moment, we're going through a process of interviewing colleagues inside Kew, colleagues and outside Kew. We're accumulating the broadest collection of literature and resources that we can. And we're trying to build up a set of examples that our peer institutions and colleagues are able to give us of best practice. So I'd like to say thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me, and we'd be very happy to provide a copy of the recommendations and of the report that we come up with at the end of January. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat. I definitely would like a copy of your report, please. And so we're going to finish this series of talk before entering the Q&A session. Remember to post your question in the chat or Q&A tips, but with Ike. So Ike, please.
Hello, everyone. Just bear with me while I share the screen. Okay, and apologies for not being able to kind of flick through. I am on an iPad as opposed to a computer. So what I wanted to talk about is the Zoological Society of London Institute of Zoology. Like a lot of organizations over the summer, there was a reckoning with the issues that Black Lives Matter brought up. But I think ZSL and IOZ was in a good position because we already had established the EDI committee. So I won't go through all the information, but the science directorate, there's 5 directorates at the Zoological Society of London, and the Institute of Zoology comes under the science directorate. So the EDI committee already existed, and there was a focus on the Athena Swan Charter, which focuses on gender equality, well-being and support, focus on all general EDI issues, not just with regard to race and ethnicity. And that it was composed of members, or is composed of members all across the science directorate, including 3 student representatives. Nathalie, who's chairing this, is also the chair of that. There is also a big emphasis on advanced data monitoring, recruitment data analysis, gender equality monitoring, protected characteristics, and career advancements. There's a monthly science newsletter, and then I was hired this year as the EDI administrator. So because of having this backbone, it really allowed us to engage and react with the issues kind of raised by Black Lives Matter, and then in turn, decolonization. IOZ and ZSL had responses to Black Lives Matter, and it was a creation of 3 committees and working groups. Prior to this issue, ZSL did not have an overarching across all 5 directorates D&I group. So now that has been created, and it's sponsored by the Director General, Dominic Jeremy. This is also, like the Science EDI Committee, will encompass all kind of protected characteristics, EDI issues that are arisen. Also, in addition to that, across ZSL is the Black Lives Matter Advisory Group, an extension of the ZSL D&I group. What I'm going to talk more about is what we're doing in science, which was an extension of the EDI committee. And it's we call it the Reno group, the Science, Race, Ethnicity, National Origin Working Group. And I'll just make a quick point without getting into it, touching on what Chris said earlier. There's obviously been debate on what terms do we use? Do we use BAME? Do we use underrepresented groups? And so Reno, I think, was a good way to kind of talk about what we're focusing on without kind of getting into the discussion about what's the appropriate term for ethnic minorities. So this is just kind of some basic statistics about the Reno group. We had our first meeting in July and have had bi-monthly meetings since. And I have to really emphasize that the passion of the students and the early career researchers has been a big driving force in all this that we're doing. Like this talk is a kind of a product of that passion that has been brought about. And I think the decolonization is a topic that across the sciences and institutions is obviously an important topic that we need to discuss. So some of the things that came about that kind of tie into decolonization, the new initiatives that Reno had kind of suggested or put in place or expanded upon that EDI was already doing, was the creation of science EDI forums. And again, it's not particularly focused on solely decolonization, but it does give an opportunity for us to engage with the student researchers and listen to their needs. And again, because decolonization is such a passion project for a lot of our students, this is a great forum where they are able to monitor it. There was already kind of, diverse social media feeds. That's been kind of expanded with the focus on decolonization papers, Black History Month, things like that. Volunteering opportunities list. And this was to increase accessibility and inclusivity of science. And it's a list of programs, particularly, I think we did a lot of work looking for ones that are focused on youth and student facing, which I'll kind of get into why shortly, work placements and learning opportunities like that. And then this Black History Month, we had Black History Month and beyond, where we featured historical figures. And I'll also tie to Miranda's point earlier. One of them was John Edmondson. So there is like this big kind of energy to all the decolonization and drawing light to history of science. And so specifically with regard to Reno and decolonization, these are some of the initiatives that we've done so far. Decolonization, ecology and conservation talks. So this event is one. We're also looking at putting together an event where Oxford researchers had done some training on decolonization. And then we're tying in new initiatives to existing formats that we have. So Science does speed talks every Thursday, where you can kind of present about new research or just any general topic. So we're going to be putting one together with a focus on challenges that BAME researchers have faced, like kind of throughout their whole process, like as students, as undergraduates, as postgrads, and then within the career. So that when we identify what some of the challenges are, we're able to tackle them better as an institution and make them more inclusive. They're also putting together, hopefully for 2021, a decolonization survey that will go to the Institute of Zoology and then another directorate, the conservation. Currently some of our students, and I won't say names, but some are on this call, are writing an amazing opinion piece about calling for fairer conservation practices and how the impacts of decolonization can be mitigated and proposed changes that they'd like to see. So what can institutions do to address decolonization if you've not started on that or if you've not heard anything about it? I'd say number one would be a creation of EDI working groups, committees, task force, etc. But it's important to include, if institutions have students, include early career researchers, because a lot, the younger generations have new ideas and have maybe talked about this in a different way than previous generations. So it's important to have inclusion of these students. Also, engaging with outreach programs, as I mentioned earlier, audit recruitment, enrollment, and hiring practices. And I think an important part is it's easy to kind of, not necessarily easy, but there's often a focus on recruiting and how are the interview processes fair? What are the kind of statistics? Are people from protected characteristics being represented? But I think what's also equally important, and which is something we're just starting to look at ourselves, is retention data. Like if you're hiring, for instance, a Black researcher, but they're only staying for about, like, average time is only a year, is there something that institutionally that's systemically wrong that we need to focus on? There could be, it just could be coincidental, but it's important to look at that retention data so and are able to make a better analysis of if practices need to be changed. Acknowledging the institutional history is quite an important aspect. And I'd say that's partly because, as we know, a lot of these older institutions, organizations have been tied to, in the past, the slave trade, imperialism. So it's important to admit the past history and celebrate the good that I think most institutions are quite good at highlighting the good things they do. But we also have to own the unfavorable elements of our history, because right now is a great opportunity with what's happening in the world to make those statements and move forward. And I would say be patient or be bold and be patient. I always tell Reno Group, be bold. But when I say be patient, it's also because, as I mentioned, earlier generations may not have tackled decolonization in the same way, but we have to remember what they did do was make strides with things like integration, racial integration, gender equality. So although every generation probably has something they tackle, and it's an important thing to tackle. So we can't be all, to quote the popular phrase, okay boomer, about some issues that maybe weren't resolved that we are now resolving now. So I think it's important for us to, push the the powers that be to moving to decolonization, but also acknowledge that they did do great strides for equality and diversity in other ways. So we have to frame it in a way that will make them listen without making them defensive, if that makes sense. And I'd say the other thing is to arrange talks and events like this. Get involved with other institutions, other student groups, and you're really able to drive change. And again, I have to really emphasize that students and early career researchers have been, every generation, like I mentioned, push and drive the conversation forward and make things happen. So I think that's kind of covers what I wanted to mention. And so there's my information. But I also just, again, want to stress, be bold and try to use the systems that maybe your institution already has, or propose changes to create new systems, new working groups, and you can accomplish a lot more.
Ike, thank you so much for this talk, and thank you to the 4 speakers for really a diverse set of different pieces of information that together formed a really nice introduction, I would say, to a very complex topic. So this is the time for questions. And I will start by a question that Helen and Lucy, who have put this event together, wanted to ask each of you, which is what would be your first piece of advice for ensuring fairer and more inclusive practice? And that might be in fieldwork, in desk-based work, in collaboration. So I'm going to go in the order of the talk, starting with Chris, and then Miranda, and then Bat and Ike. Chris.
Yeah, I think in terms of fieldwork, just keep my answer short, I think there's 2 different ways of looking at it. One is in terms of the requirement as is stated for accreditation by the Geological Society of London, understanding that not all students can undertake fieldwork and recognising that there are other contributions to be made to become a geologist beyond simply doing fieldwork. So kind of that top level, how we view fieldwork, I think is important. And then I think at the other level is then if we have a certain amount of fieldwork in a geoscience degree course, is making sure that that experience is inclusive for students. So we wrote a piece about some of the particular risks that are brought on BIPOC, which was the term we used in this American piece, people and staff and students as a function of being in rural communities where they're not used to seeing non-white people. So I think, part of it is like a kind of what we expect people to do. The other thing is how we treat people when we ask them to go and do it.
Miranda.
You might have to repeat the question again, although I agree with everything that Chris was saying.
So what would be your first piece of advice for ensuring fairer and more inclusive practice?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for respect throughout all of our communities as well. And in terms of, I agree a lot with what you say, Chris, in terms of fieldwork. That's a big issue here where I work. And also stemming from fieldwork in terms of EDI is that whatever materials you create, notes and data, to think about the inclusivity in terms of that. And when you publish your work, who you're collaborating with, who are the authors on the paper, who were you documented that you actually worked with, so that I don't or anybody else have to do the same work to find those people, those hidden figures that have been instrumental in terms of your fieldwork and your research, especially when you go out of the UK and working in other places such as, America, South America, or Africa, to document in a way that you're inclusive in your practice of those peoples that you're working with that reside in those countries. So that information, and then that's something that goes into my work as documenting collections and other things to put into databases. That's a whole other thing as well, collections databases, and where you put that information so that people can find it, but that it's there already within those scientific reports and those papers for then for me to pick up with those collections that might be deposited in the museum, and that data goes on the label, acknowledging everyone and being inclusive in that practice, and also into a database as well. So you've got that history.
Pat.
In my opinion, there's one very important thing that all of us can be doing right now. And this is keeping our eyes open, keeping our ears open, and keeping our minds open to the inequalities and to the things that are going wrong, which we're not seeing, because no matter who you are in the system, there is something happening which you're not aware of, because things are very complicated and none of us see the true picture all the time. And once people become more aware and once we pay more attention, that in itself can go a long way towards helping things, in my opinion.
And Ike.
And yeah, just to echo a kind of a amalgamation of what everyone said is, you know, engaging with the local communities, be they abroad on field work or within London on when you're engaging with communities of color. We have to remember that not every ethnic group, racial, socioeconomic group has the same access maybe and have never been to the London Zoo. So they're not necessarily going to have this passion to get into ecology, zoology, the STEM sciences. So we have to engage, I think, people at a youth at a younger level and introduce them to the zoo. And I know there's or to Kew Gardens and things like that. And we have to kind of understand where people's relationships with the environment and ecology and animal life, etc., are when we're trying to do research and move forward.
So as expected, we have like 1 million questions and 8 minutes. So I'm gonna try to go as quickly as possible. And then I think that the other question might be transferred to the Padlet. So hopefully this can be answered there. So first question, is there any low-hanging fruit action that Institute can take whilst also working on long-term change? Ike or Chris?
Yeah, I guess I would say like identify, if you're not collecting data, like recruitment, who the makeup of your own staffing and student body are, like that's the first place to start. Like you have to know what you're composed of. And that's something that doesn't necessarily need a new EDI person. Like there's hopefully existing HR structures that you can work with.
And for Chris, Miranda, or Bat, do you have any tips for tackling people who refuse to engage?
Don't bother. Save your energy for yourself and move on.
Yeah, I agree with Chris, because doing this work takes a lot of energy anyway. And if you're one of the few that are embarking on this work, continue to do it. You've got to think about self-care, self-preservation, yeah, and move on. Eventually, they'll come around, but yeah, you've just got to move on and do.
So then a question for Bat, because I can see she's not. Bat, do you think that there are increased barriers for inclusion due to COVID, meaning that we are not present physically?
Yes, I can see increased barriers every day, because people who struggle socioeconomically and people who have bigger childcare responsibilities are less able to work efficiently from home. I am an active editor of journals, and I've seen my journal submission demographics swing around as soon as pandemic started and working from home started.
And then a question.
I'm not necessarily getting better, sadly.
Yeah. Maybe this one I think is for Chris. So can we use all the virtual fieldwork expedition that have been developed during COVID to make geology more inclusive and also engage a wider audience to encourage school children to apply to geosciences?
Absolutely, yeah. People are putting a lot of work over the last, well, even before COVID, developing some amazing virtual field trip experiences, which not only we can use for those purposes to go and get people before they even apply to university, but also for people who have different ability statuses as well. So we can actually enliven that field experience for them. So absolutely. And then there are platforms already. There was lots of discussions in the summer with some amazing people doing some amazing pro bono work, putting together platforms that could be used to collate virtual field trips and making them freely available.
And then something that comes quite a lot is about the introduction of new barriers. So we're always in a changing field, isn't it? And so one person in particular is raising the fact that the charges for MSc, I believe here, has now raised to 16,000 for home fees. And so their question is, do you agree that there's a new barriers? Do you agree that it's not systematically getting better? And what can we do about it? But go.
I'd like to jump in and say that I think we should critically evaluate this culture of excellence, so-called excellence that we have in the British sciences nowadays, because so many people use the word excellence and then they use an awful lot of cultural prejudice shortcuts to judge that excellence completely incorrectly, and it's incredibly harmful.
Yeah, there's actually another question that goes straight within that point. Is someone saying that they see major problems in the selection processes for DTP that biases against by so BAM or people of color, however the word we use. So how can we radically change DTP candidate selection to improve this, and how can we force top-down change for Research Council? Bet Chris, you want to jump on this one?
Yeah, I've shouted at lots of people about this, including your own director, I think, of this of the London DTP. I think there's a lot of things which and it goes directly to Bat's point, this obsession with excellence and this obsession with the best, and the failure of institutions after they've selected based on criteria 4 years on to actually assess whether they got what they wanted from those criteria, right? And we never do that, yet we still think we're getting the best. And what we really want are numbers to make ourselves feel better about ourselves, that we've done something vaguely scientific with metrics. Sorry for the rant, but Bat, that's spot on.
I'm going to go for Ike to have someone that is a bit external to the UK system and ask him this, which is what of the attendee asking. Do you think the Russell group, so you know the Russell group, do you think this is a useful thing to have? Is someone asking that?
Personally, no. Like, I mean, the US, that's obviously where I'm from, and there's just kind of, every state is so different, and there's private universities, public universities, there's like state systems. But yeah, I just kind of, I don't really understand the point of having a Russell group personally. I don't understand why it's not just a nationwide all university thing. They're all working together to a common goal. And yeah, the Russell group, it reminds me of Ivy League's kind of system. There's obviously a difference of fees, like the Russell group is more accessible despite the fees rising than the Ivy League system in the US. But yeah, I don't kind of understand why. It's also making people feel like, who maybe didn't get into those universities, that maybe they're not good enough and maybe they can't pursue more advanced careers and doctorate degrees. And I don't really think that that's a fair interpretation for people to have.
And remember that the Russell group is self-selecting.
And so my last question, because it is 58, but I think that is a pretty good and interesting question. So someone is asking, do you think that there is transferability? So for example, Chris, you were talking about lesson learned and looking at what's happening in the geosciences. And this person is asking, well, actually, what is the lesson learned that you can transfer to maybe inform issues around gender or sexual orientation? Or do you think actually it's separate entities and should be treated as such?
I mean, because I've answered a few questions, I'd just say there's an intersectional aspect here, isn't there? Many of the issues that we're talking about that generally affect racial and ethnic minorities, affect people of different disability status, different gender identities. They are groups who are marginalized because they are different and they don't historically fit in a certain space. So yeah, we have collective bargaining power and collective lobbying power, I think. And
Miranda, do you agree that you can get stronger by bringing them together?
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, at the Natural History Museum, we've got a diversity working group, and we work collectively together. It's a holistic approach, you know, with all of this. So we said, you know, we're all helping each other. So yeah, I don't think they should be separate.
So it's 3 o'clock. I have to close this session, but I would like to say a big thank you, and I can just do this, but hopefully the other do that too. To really thank you for 4 really good talk, engaging talk. I'm really hoping that people are gonna jump in Padlet because there has been question that has been unanswered on the Zoom call, but also on the Padlet. So speakers, if you have time, 5 minutes, have a look and then jump. I know, Chris, there's a lot of question about data, especially for you about whether you get various data for different group. But in general, thank you very much. I know this is recorded, so please do share it as wide as possible. And then the only thing I have to say before finishing, and thank you very much to Lucy and Helen for putting this together and making it a really good event just before Christmas. So thank you very much for attending, and have all a good holiday season.